planning on talking. I'm just here for the show.
It's gonna be a show. Don't know if Zoom will be able to handle it.
I'll find a way. Always does.
All right, the stream is good.
Cool. I think we're gonna do video off for everybody else who's not being interviewed, just so for the live stream and everything, it looks like a more of an interview setup, if that's cool.
Mm-hmm.
Well, how did Carson, you, oh wow, that was so cool. You like shut off your video, but your background was still there somehow. It's fancy.
It's disappeared into the virtual
awesome. Cool, let's see. Still a couple last minute people joining, so we'll just wait like another 30, 60 seconds or so. Also, Andrew, I assume the live streams and everything going well?
Yeah, it's good.
Andrew on ETHGlobal. It's
Yeah.
confusing. All right, sweet. Maybe we'll just get started here. Awesome. Well, welcome everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, no matter where you are in the world. We're excited to be here with Textile team and with Andrew and Sander in particular. Textile's been one of our key sponsors for this event and really providing just a ton of technology. Some we're definitely going to talk about in the next couple minutes, just to all the hackers, so that everybody can build super easily on IPFS or Filecoin or what have you. So really thankful to have them. We think that they're going to level up a lot of projects, and ultimately that's the best way that they can help out. So really appreciate that. And of course, if you have any questions about anything as you're building with their tech, feel free to drop a note in their channel. And they've been super responsive. So thanks again for being super responsive as well. So it's been awesome having you guys at the event. So purpose of today's chat is basically just get a little bit kind of behind the scenes look, I guess, if you will, on kind of how Textile got started, what you guys are working on, the future, the current, the new, the old, just basically get an idea of kind of everything about Textile, and have a little bit more of a kind of in-depth look beyond just the tech level that everybody I think has been interacting with so far, but kind of get a sense for where we started and how we got to where we are. So intros aside, I'd love to maybe just dive in, starting from the beginning in a way, maybe starting with Andrew. Love to kind of hear a little bit more about sort of like your kind of early stages of your career, your background. If you went to school, like what did you study, and also what were sort of the first couple things you did in that transition period?
Yeah, sure. So I don't know where to start. I mean, I guess university, I studied biology. I got my PhD in biodiversity informatics, and I don't know, it's kind of like very easy to thread the needle when you look back to see how you end up where you are. But I think it was a pretty not obvious path to where I am now. However, when I was studying biology, one of the areas that we were working on was how to turn data into information more quickly for science. So how we could understand environmental change, how we could understand human impacts, how we could understand extinction and these big topics where you wanted these big data pipelines and you wanted to be able to crunch them very quickly and turn them into more and more layers of information. And what was really cool is we were working on some networks that at the time were really touching on some ideas that I think this community is getting at now. So a really interesting one is how the natural history museums were collecting and connecting data sets. They had this interesting problem because all the natural history museums at, say, for example, at universities, they had these historical collections of biodiversity data. So the actual drawers of, say, birds or beetles that scientists had gone out in the field and collected. Sorry, this is a bit of a diversion because you asked, but I'll get back to where I ended up. But I think it's a really interesting thing. So basically, as biologists, those are some of the best data we have for historical biodiversity because they're actual points out in the field that people collected, and we can look at them and we can tell, exactly what species they are, what their characteristics were. And so when I was starting my PhD, it was during this sort of peak period of digitizing that information, which actually was a great opportunity for natural history museums, but also represented a risk, because if you think about digitizing one of their greatest values, which are these collections, and putting it out in the world for free, what then is the value for the museum anymore? And so they started building these networks that were federated networks, where the actual museum would be responsible for curating and hosting their own data. And then it would move up through the federated network to these different thematic collections and gateway portals to search and find that data as scientists, with one of the top ones being a directive of the UN called the Global Biodiversity Information Facility, GBIF. It's still out there. It's a really great institution. And so they were just struggling with a lot of the same problems about data interoperability, like what sort of community standards, what was the future of this data once you connect it all. And I really started digging into that and getting very interested in a lot of those problems early on. I ended up having a side project that was always there, which was, I was very interested in how science was communicating to the public and how we could make that better. And I got really into data visualization, and in particular mapping. And I was sort of, I had a foot in both worlds of evolution and working on phylogenies and biodiversity and looking at mapping and niche modeling and all those things. And that's actually where Sandra and I first worked together. Sandra and I were friends before we started working together, but we got a small grant from the National Science Foundation and built a pretty awesome data visualization tool back at the like advent of basically, you know, HTML5 and canvas-based rendering and all that good stuff. But I got more and more into the data visualization, and I went and had some friends that started a company that they wanted to build better mapping tools for scientists and researchers and NGOs. And they asked me to come join that company. And so we built a startup called CartoDB. Now it's just called carto.com. I spent 5 or 6 years there, kind of wearing a lot of different hats, everything from like marketing and growth and engineering and eventually really focusing on research and where we could take, back to that question of where we could take data and extracting information from it. And at that point, Sandra and I got back together and we're like, we should figure out what we want to work on for the next 20 years, you know? And I really liked the process of building the company from scratch. I really liked those early years. And so ended up back here working on Textile with Sandra.
Very cool. And I love asking this question just because kind of the diversity of backgrounds that people who come into Web3 have is just always astounding to me. So PhD in biology, seems kind of a little bit far away, but I love how you kind of brought all that together. Maybe same question to you, Sandra. I'd love to know a little bit more about you know, what your early days and what you were working on, and then we can touch on that part where you and Andrew came together and started talking about Textile.
Yeah. Well, I actually went to school for mechanical engineering. I grew up working in a machine shop, and I did that through college. And then in my engineering studies, I came in contact with a professor that really got me on the software track, doing like MATLAB numerical stuff. And from there, I just kind of sort of a long story how I ended up as a pure software person, but I kind of stayed as a hybrid working up until an electric motorcycle company called Mission Motors. And this was back in 2009-ish. And it was about a 50-person company of just hybrid of all different kinds of engineers. And I started getting really into big data and electric vehicle telemetry. And I ended up doing that for quite a while, and then building some big systems at other companies as well. And then yeah, Andrew and I started talking again, and I was feeling like, you know, like a lot of people do at larger companies, where you start to be kind of like a cog working on these large systems. And I just felt like I really wanted to have more of an impact on people's well-being, like in the moment. And so I started getting really into like quantified self and thinking about tracking personal data and all this stuff, and having no really idea about Web3 or early IPFS days or anything like that. So around that same time, Andrew and I were talking and trying to figure out, we knew we wanted to do something together. So just trying to figure out where to try and make an impact. And we took a couple different initial starts, but we eventually landed on the same sort of problem that we had been scratching our brains with, realizing this huge community had already been thinking about this for a long time and had made big strides in this direction of, how do we enable technology to continue improving our lives by solving real problems and by, taking insights about ourselves and turning that into value, but doing that in a way that protects you from, just the engines of advertising and all that kind of stuff. So still a huge challenges there, obviously, but yeah, it's just a really, really rewarding, fulfilling problems to think about. So
very cool.
Yeah, that's about it.
Awesome. And what did those kind of early conversations look like between you two? Like, were there kind of other ideas you didn't pursue? Obviously you settled on what Textile is now, but like what were some of the kind of those early conversations and discoveries? And maybe if this leads in also like what your aha moment looked like with crypto or with Web3 in general. If you could touch on that, that'd be great too.
I can take a stab at that, and then if you want to fill in anything I miss here, Sander, but probably just really briefly, basically, I remember actually like one of the earliest conversations Sander and I had when we were trying to figure this out was that because I was working in the mapping world, we were working with a lot of different companies that were trying to figure out what to do with their geospatial data in order to drive their next business decision or figure out the next product feature or whatever. And so I started having exposure to data sets of real people moving around the world, where you could zoom in on a map and see more or less some resolution timescale dots of people moving around. And I remember Sander and I talking about that and just going like, is that right? Like, do those dots know that they're in that dot data set? Like, is that the world that we really want to be part of? And that was a real, like, I think that's always been kind of part of the motivation. Sander said we had a couple false starts. Like one of the false starts we had was we said, okay, if the premise here, like I think we had a couple early ideas that still are pretty core to Textile. One is we thought that data needed greater interoperability. It's clear that data on the internet is pretty broken, and interoperability is one of the kind of foundational pieces that just isn't baked into the internet as we know it. And so if we could figure out ways to add greater interoperability, we could sort of fix that component of the web. And then the other was sort of sovereignty and kind of control and ownership, and or at least visibility into what's happening with your data afterwards. And so we started talking about those two things. And one of the early ideas that we had was like, okay, it's clear that one of the big problems going on are these data pipelines that just are consuming data as quickly as they can pull it out. And a lot of times they don't have a particular value that they're trying to extract. They just know it will be valuable. And so we're losing these data sets from ourselves that are going off to any company that can collect it as fast as they can collect it, so they can either sell it, warehouse it for later use, or sometimes put it into the flywheel to create value from advertising or whatever. And so one of our first ideas was like, okay, maybe we can just help those companies that don't really want to collect it. They just want to get information from it. And we spent quite a while working on the area of looking if we could put better machine learning tools directly onto the device so that your data would never have to leave the device for applications to get insights about you and trigger events around you. We didn't make much headway there. I mean, we spent quite a lot of time seeing what kind of models we could build and what could really be built there. And that's when we found basically IPFS was the first thing we found. We were like, oh, okay, if we could re-architect the way APIs work around interoperable data, maybe we could still have a lot of the values created off the device, and maybe we don't have to like force the platforms to change in order to get our vision to work. We can actually just build really cool services and systems around interoperable data. And then we started just hacking and building on IPFS.
yeah, one of the insights we had around that initial product was just talking to potential customers and trying to get them, to use our on-device machine learning platform. And invariably, people were very much interested in the concept, but then they would talk to their data teams and they would come back with, well, actually, we just want all the data, which, because they just don't really know what they want yet. They just kind of want to throw it out and throw it all into their black boxes and see what kind of cool things pop out. It makes sense, but it was sort of like one of those duh moments.
Yeah, we had a pretty big moment there, which I thought was like a significant moment in the history of the company, where I think everything we'd built to date to that point was like, we were doing some really awesome feature extraction tools for machine learning directly on device. That was like the key thing we had built so far. So we could take a pretty rough input of data on device and create this really cool stream of features. And that's what would drive some really basic, simple models. And then what Sander's saying is we realized that they still just wanted those extra features off device. And we decided to just turn ourselves completely and said, like, nah, that's not what we really want to build. And yeah, that was all at that moment where we discovered IPFS and everything.
Very cool. Yeah, I mean, maybe we can dive into the sort of discovery of IPFS and like what has been the, I guess, the face of Textile now that everybody can recognize. But I guess, like, when you first started getting into IPFS, I think probably Buckets was probably the first product that you had launched at some point. What does kind of Buckets provide that is different than just like natively using IPFS, and just sort of like, what did you find made it so that was like a compelling thing to build over and above what IPFS already provided?
That's a Sander question.
Well, yeah, I mean, so Buckets are kind of a user-friendly skin on top of a Unix FS directory. And they sort of gloss over some of the things that take just a couple extra steps to do yourself, like IPNS, addressing, like full node encryption, and pinning. So those things combined kind of create this, the idea was to create an experience that feels more like a Web 2 experience, but still carries with it the things that we know and love, like content addressing and the ability to flush to Filecoin using our PowerGate. So I mean, that's kind of a tag-on product. But yeah, the general idea is, we saw a lot of people just wanting to throw data up onto somewhere, and not have to think about this concept of pinning, which makes sense that we need to think about that in this world, but it's not necessarily an intuitive thing.
Yeah, just to add to that, I think I get really excited about Buckets. It's like it kind of like wraps up a lot of the Textile sort of approach to these things, which is to say, like, let's try to take these protocols that make data more open or make data more decentralized and try to make them very simple for developers that aren't necessarily thinking about that first. And so, like, pinning is a great example of that, where the pinning concept becomes very obvious if you've already been working in Ethereum and you already have to figure out how to get data from a contract or reference data from a smart contract. But if we're trying to talk to somebody who's just building a React app, and then we're telling them that their images need to be pinned, it's a pretty foreign concept. But if you can instead tell them, oh, you need to take that app and you need to put it in a bucket, and a bucket is just a folder, and then behind the scenes the pinning is there, it gives them that sort of reverse way to then learn more about the pinning, learn more about what it means to have IPFS nodes, what it means to have local or remote nodes. It just gives a much more, what our goal is, a much more sort of easy landing point where everything makes sense in all the framework that you already understand, and then you can grow from there to learn all about the network.
Yeah, and then being more true to folks that do understand those things or aren't just playing around, because that's another thing. It's got to be easy to start building, and maybe you haven't checked every single box that you know you want to check, but the key thing is can I build what I'm trying to build? And then being true to like the folks that want more like, you know, actual offline or local nodes and stuff like that. So you can run a bucket server locally if you want. So that's just a very important caveat, you know. It's not, you're not locked into someone else's infrastructure necessarily. And it's backed by our Threads DB, which is also something that you can run yourself, but you can get started using a hosted node.
Yeah, I think that that's a cool caveat, I think, to dive into a little bit. You know, like, I think like kind of the theme of some of these discussions is just trying to understand like how different companies like approach the sort of user experience difficulty that is sort of like going the full decentralization / like security way versus like, you know, making things kind of easier onboarding. You know, I know that Textile, especially like around PowerGate, is, you know, hosting your own nodes and that sort of thing, and you know, be part of the infrastructure, but you know, arguably in like a slightly centralized type way. I guess like where, you know, how do you see the kind of trade-off between like the kind of initial developer onboarding experience and just like being able to build, like you just mentioned, versus like, you know, kind of keeping everything kind of very decentralized and that sort of thing. So yeah, if you could dive in, I think a little bit on that kind of local hosting and that caveat, I think that'd be really useful for everybody.
Yeah, well, I could do a little further there. I think that basically usability is the first problem always when developing developer tools. And so providing hosted services is just like it's a very easy way to get developers that aren't already thinking about these things to start using them and not have to go through the trouble or the learning process of understanding how to onboard to a decentralized network. So not running your own nodes. And also if you're trying to build something for developers and you force them to be only using the fully decentralized model, it means that they also have to do that for their end users, which isn't something that all developers want to do. And I really think that if we want to have success in Web3, the next 2 years is all about bringing Web 2 over. And the more we can bring them over with things they're just familiar with, the more success I think we're going to have. And so our goal is really just to make all of the hosted things interoperable. Like you can tear it apart, like you can put your data there, but you don't have to believe that it will be there. And that's like some of the demos that we've done with PowerGate, where like you could put your data there and actually have it be backed by deals and Filecoin, where the Textile hub could go away tomorrow and you could still go get your data out of the network. So really it's about building your app so that it works. It just will work faster or scale a little bit more if it also uses the hub. But if the hub goes away, it will still work. And that's been a lot of our kind of guiding principle. That's hard. I mean, there's still a lot to build. So it's definitely not a complete vision, but totally what we work on.
Yeah, I mean, it's just got to be like a combination of tools, you know. There's no silver, or what we found at least, there's no silver bullet to, like, going back to that sort of intro that we covered around, you know, how do we keep technology that's needs more and more data doing good things for us and with our well-being in mind. And it's just, there's so many tools at our disposal, like encryption, you know, content addressing, blockchains, trying to use those things all together in sort of a nice harmony, while also providing that UX. It's really a hard thing.
Gotcha. Yeah, I think it's I think it's a difficult choice that, and kind of bridge to cross on the whole just Web3 ecosystem in general. And yeah, I think just personally, like, offsetting and making it as easy as possible for Web2 developers, you know, has certainly paid off for at least this hackathon, and certainly like in general,
I have this,
providing. Yeah, go ahead.
I just have this thing that I haven't like sold it hard inside the company, but I talk about it occasionally, and I haven't figured out how to measure it yet. But I really think that the driving KPI that as a company, I think we've kind of arrived at it, even if we haven't totally measured it yet. And I think we will figure out how to measure it. But I think it needs to be sort of the guiding KPI of all companies building in this space, which is time to failure. And so our goal right now is to build tools that allow developers to try them and fail as quickly as possible so that they can learn whether they can build their idea or it's not going to work. And not because our technology fails, but because their idea maybe doesn't work. And the reason I think that's really important is if you look at success on the web, if you look at success during Web 2, if you look at success in companies and building for society in general, there's rarely ever sort of a planned success. Instead, there's sort of a trail of thousands of failures. And I think if we want Web 3 to be successful, we need to enable that trail of thousands of failures, which it doesn't mean that we have to set developers up for success. It means we have to invite thousands of developers to come try very quickly and try building their ideas very quickly and just figure out if their idea works and if it sticks and if it has that like slight little edge that will make it blow up and be the next interesting thing. And so that KPI for me is, I think, the one that we'll be focusing more and more on.
I like that. That's a super interesting way of looking at things, because it's definitely true that, in Web 2, I could have a website tomorrow, right? And having that fail as quickly as possible so that I can iterate, improve, incredibly valuable, I think, for I think really like how we've developed software in general. In the Web 2 world. And yeah, to bring that to Web 3, I think that's a great KPI.
And if you think about it, like, if you think about the way developers outside of our community are building things, so like building something for the Facebook platform or building something for the App Store, it's a very different feeling. And there, not only does it have that KPI, there's another thing that that's still tricky, which is on those platforms, the audience discovery is more clear. And I think that's another big area that we'll be trying to figure out, and we won't be the only ones figuring it out. I think that this community's been trying to figure that out. But if you're a developer, who's going to see the thing you're building? Who's going to get it? Who's going to be able to play with it? And helping developers figure that out, I think, is really important too.
Yeah, it's sort of, using any kind of tools, whether it's building something physically or digitally, it should be fun and not hamper the creative process. So
totally agree. Maybe,
a tall order, but it's, yeah.
Yeah, maybe we can dive into this a little bit as like sort of like a segue to, kind of what are the next things you guys think you'll be working on? I know obviously PowerGate is still a big focus, but I guess maybe 2-point question is, one is like, what keeps you guys working on Textile? Like what's exciting, what's interesting about the problem you're solving, at least personally for you? And then also, yeah, like, are you thinking about tackling these kind of bigger community user issues? Like what kind of the next pieces look like? If you're able to chat about those, and yeah, I guess just a little bit about that.
Senator, you want to go first?
Yeah. Well, I guess, just the recent integration with PowerGate has been, or Filecoin via PowerGate has been really exciting for me. Just seeing this concept around data interoperability and user ownership of data in our hosted systems, be able to be sort of leveraging this purely decentralized storage backend and seeing data added through buckets, for example, through the hub, being archived to Filecoin and then restored using the Lotus client, for example, from a totally different location on the web is kind of really it really is a satisfying thing, because it's sort of the full circle combining all these tools for me.
Yeah, I'd reiterate that. I think that the Filecoin vision and where it kind of slots into the network is super important, and it's been kind of a missing piece for IPFS, right? Because a lot of people it's been a hard gap to understand, the incentive models for persisting on a network, and so getting that solution in there, I think, helps so many ideas then become real, which is super exciting. I'm also really excited. Another kind of area I'm excited about is back to that KPI. I think like this hackathon has been pretty awesome for us because it's shown us some new ideas and reinforced some other ideas that we've had about where the usability challenges are. and what we can really build to help lower those and help people just get their idea done faster. And so that's really exciting to me. And I think, like, to say it again, I think a hackathon like this is really exciting because it brings so many people that are just giving that really fast feedback, and that's been awesome. So I'm really excited about the next sort of wave of outputs we'll have, which is pretty cool.
Yeah,
So
I mean, just to add to that a little bit, the sort of, you take threads and buckets and that's sort of a database and object storage, and making that work like a platform like MongoDB plus Realm. If you ever use Realm on mobile, it's just like a magical experience. And it does all this offline sync and stuff like that. And we're going to be releasing some tools around that in the near future, which is going to be awesome.
Cool, awesome, sweet. So maybe I'll turn it over to the audience. If anybody has a question, feel free to sort of unmute and turn on your video if you can. If not, happy to keep the conversation driving. We'll just wait a moment. All right, doesn't look like there's gonna be any biters live. Cool, so maybe I'll give you guys, I'll ask another question and then I'll give everybody in the audience time to think up of one of their own. So I know, like, we'll kind of going back to like halfway through the conversation, we chatted about sort of the early days of Textile and the first kind of products you were working on, and I guess that pivotal decision that led you down this path, and keeping in, even in terms of like your morals and ethics personally, I think that was great. Maybe it would be great to kind of chat about a couple other decisions that either like early on that were either very good decisions that paid out dividends later, or bad decisions that you ended up having to fight off later. I think kind of every startup has a great period of uncertainty at the beginning, and I think it's useful for people who are listening or are otherwise watching this later, who may have companies for the first time in their lives after this event. So I guess it'd be cool to hear a little bit more about those early days and some of those decisions.
I have some ideas. So I'm like a big, I'm a really big fan of building, a company you want to work at. That's like super important. And I think that we've done that pretty well. Like I wake up every morning and I really like working with the team and everything. So I think hiring has been really awesome, but let me finish that thought. Hiring's been really awesome. So Carson, Ignacio, Aaron, they're all killer teammates. And so if you are starting a project, think very carefully about the team that you're going to bring on, because going on sort of a years-long journey with them you're going to hit challenges. And I've never felt like my team hasn't had my back and that we haven't been able to make hard decisions together pretty quickly too. Like, that time that we had to turn our back on potential customers and a potential business, I think we made the decision in like a 1 or 2 hour phone call with everybody. And we were like, cool, new direction, let's go, let's figure it out. I think that we had a team retreat that was like, fortunately, already scheduled right after that. We were all in a house together for a week. And it was one of our best team retreats. We just spent a week going like, cool, what next? And that was really exciting. But that's another really important thing. So we're a venture-backed company. We have investors, and we've raised money. But I think we've gotten really lucky because we have really great investors. And I've always thought like that when you take investment, it's really important to think about your investors like they're going to be part of that team. Like, do you want to work with them every day? You're not going to work with them every day, but like, do you see them eye to eye, and are you able to have good conversations and get candid feedback? And so that moment that we went through that sort of hard decision, our investment team was just like, cool, go do it. That's awesome. And that's really important. And they've always had our back and have always really respected our points of view and where we're going. So for me, team in all directions has been really great. And I think that's like one of the most important things in the journey.
Yeah, absolutely. All about people. I think, yeah, we've been really lucky on our team. Everyone can be a leader and a follower and high five along the way. Yeah, it's really great.
I got a
Awesome.
private question here. Somebody asked me, and I think they just asked in private in case I didn't want to answer, but they asked if I'd talk about Textile's business model a bit. And I'm happy to talk about that. So we don't currently have a very strong business model. Like you'll see, we don't charge for anything. And that's totally driven out of two facts. One, we think the market is really early. And so we're trying to figure out what exactly are people want, what do people want, and what will they be willing to pay for? And so to that KPI of letting people fail fast, we really want just people to onboard as much as possible and try these APIs out and try these tools out without having to make the commitment of what kind of payment plan do they want to be part of, or is their idea even, does it even have revenue that they can pay for these things? Really, we're in a fortunate position where we can really be experimental right now and just put these things out. But then more long-term, what our business model will be, I think that there's actually some pretty obvious directions of where we could go in kind of like a traditional SaaS direction where you'd be using our APIs and paying for them. We've already had some requests, and this is something that we've talked about quite a bit, was having more kind of interesting models within that. So letting application developers have like user pay models where the users are actually paying to keep their data persisted or moving around the network. A lot of the architecture around the Powergate is actually could enable things like that. And then we have less traditional business models that we're exploring. Like I think that in the Filecoin ecosystem, there's probably going to be a lot of opportunities for specific tokens. And so we have that in the back of our minds too. But we haven't committed to anything there, and we're not certain what it will really look like. But we're just kind of in that experimental, try things really fast right now, see where the market is, see what people want, and try to put out some really valuable things. So the answer is like, those are all on our mind, but we don't have a concrete direction yet.
Very cool. Awesome. And I guess I think you kind of briefly mentioned, the fact that you're a venture-backed company. I think it became kind of interesting because we've had some of the products and projects that have come out of the Hack Money event, and we expect for this one too, go on to start doing the venture capital side of things. Maybe if you could just talk really generally about what it's like raising in a sort of like in a very future type leaning way, in a way where the technology, like you mentioned, is still very early. The market is early. Just kind of touch briefly on like how investors receive that sort of thing, and just kind of different techniques on dealing with that.
Yeah, it's a really tricky thing. I think that the whole blockchain and crypto community really opened the door. I think there's a lot more VCs today that are willing to back more speculative projects. Maybe we're in a dip since we were a year or two ago, but generally much more willing to back speculative projects and really back projects that are trying to do the preliminary research that could lead to big transformative projects. But it's still tricky. I think that having a clear sort of vision about where your market could be and who you're really talking to and what problems you're really addressing haven't changed, like versus just doing a traditional kind of startup out there. And so I think that's the most important thing. Like I hear kind of through our VCs, I'll talk with other companies and things like that. And I think that tends to be one of the biggest separators between companies that get funded right now and companies that don't, are whether or not they do have that clear vision of where their market is going to be and whether they have the tools to go and talk to that market and get your product out there. And so I think that's not always the easiest thing for a first-time entrepreneur. It wasn't easy for me to think about that. You just want to go build technology, and if you build it, people are going to use it. But that's not necessarily the way it's going to work. And so thinking about, what are your different strategies to get it in front of people and to get people really building on the things that you're or building or using the things that you're creating. I don't know if that helped at all, but the other thing is network. I mean, it's really important to have a strong network. And so make sure that you're out there talking to people and learning from people and meeting people as much as possible, because even if they're not going to invest in you, the more that you can get introductions and so warm introductions from people you already know, or just talk directly to VCs that already know you, it's going to be 100 times easier than sort of the cold process. And so because of my last startup, I already knew investors that were investing in that startup, so it was much easier to move. And then they opened doors to meeting investors after that, and so that sort of like, who's your early network of VCs is such an important problem to figure out too. So yeah, who's your market and who's your network of VCs are kind of the two big problems to figure out outside of your technology.
Gotcha. I think those are very helpful.
Sorry guys, I might have dropped out.
No, you're all good.
I was just going to add, I'm not sure what Andrew just covered there, but just the same rules seem to apply. Like if you're a super product driven company, and you're making this widget, who's going to buy it? Does it work? And that kind of stuff seems to be still extremely important, which makes sense.
Yeah, I think that's valuable to know, is that, in a lot of cases, this experience shouldn't be that different. So you should, really be focused on those core, the value, the market, those types of principles that there are a lot of resources for, which is also convenient. Jay, I see you have your hand up. Is it possible that means you have a question?
Yes, I was starting to type it in the chat box, but I was just wondering, it's very early still for the Textile toolkit and so forth, but what are some of the most innovative applications you've seen built upon the toolkits and tool set, and what are the most surprising applications?
Well, I have a few that are really interesting. So I think I don't know if you've been following Fleek's work. So Fleek has been going really deep into some of the technology, and I think one of the cool things about what Fleek is up to that's really exciting for us is back to that interoperability story. Is really, they've been looking deeply at how we've put together the buckets and the threads protocols and seeing how they can build new and alternative APIs that, or like local APIs as well with their space daemon that expose those same protocols in those same formats, which is really cool, because then you can think of, you can start thinking of more services that build around those objects that then people will be able to do things with their data. So that's really cool, and it's definitely different than we imagined some of the early products would be using the Textile stack. And then another really cool one is Slate. I don't know if you've been following what Slate's up to over on the Protocol Labs team, but they've been really just so quick to adopt the PowerGate APIs and really be figuring out how to use them and giving us great feedback. So we've been able to iterate really quickly on making some usable APIs there. And that's just like such a cool community that's built really quickly around a product. So I've never seen anything like that, the way that they've been getting so much sort of people contributing and excited about building this product all together. So that's super cool. And I've been really enjoying watching that unfold. Another one that we're starting to work with just early days is WorldBrain. That's a really cool product for organizing kind of it's sort of your knowledge layer on top of your internet sort of behavior. So you can kind of mark up and organize what you learn on the web and things that you're learning off the web as well. But they're starting to look at integrating with some of the Textile stack to, again, give users that interoperable data storage, and hopefully in the future Filecoin storage for your knowledge graph. They do some really cool things with like organizational knowledge graphs, which are really cool and exciting. And that stuff gets back to, Sander mentioned that we were always interested in that personal data aspect. And so that gets into a really cool area of kind of personal and organizational data that I think is really exciting. So check out WorldBrain for sure. Those are kind of three really good ones.
Since you mentioned organizational data, You know, I've been delighted to see that you have a whole application for organizations. What are you seeing with organizations starting to use the textile toolkits, and how do you see organizations adopting this and creating entire platforms for their companies on this?
I think the organization thing first was to scratch our own itch. Like, could we create buckets, for example, that as a team, we were able to all be working on those same buckets? Were we able to start, you know, pushing our documentation out to IPNS, or, but have it in sort of that way that we could all manage it? It's interesting because it's very hard to think of like group managed data on IPFS. Group managed dynamic data on IPFS has like several layers of abstraction that would be hard for any developer to just build overnight. But I think what Sander and the other guys have done with buckets and threads kind of like it pulls that all away and just makes it, okay, I have a folder that I want to sync to a remote node. I want to give permission to this other person where they can also be updating the state of that folder. That's a really cool concept on IPFS, and I think we have a lot more to do as far as like showing all the possibility there.
Yeah, I think it'll be interesting to see and just do some case studies around organizational usage and figure out how we can help that.
Cool, awesome. Any other questions from the audience? Otherwise, we can do a nice wrap-up question. All right, maybe I'll ask the now very common last question. You know, I know obviously you're busy working on Textile and you know, with the day-to-day there, but you know, if you were in the place of some of these hackers and you know, otherwise maybe you know weren't working on anything full time or kind of had all the time in front of you and a 30-day window to build something awesome, what would you be building right now if you were in their place?
Well, I had something I thought about working on, and then I just got too deep in current Textile stuff. But I think you could, with a few API changes, maybe a couple hacks, you could make a pretty cool live streaming feature built on top of a bucket. So you just take the camera from your computer, and then you just start writing those blocks to a stream endpoint on a bucket, which would need to be tweaked, but I think it wouldn't be too hard. And then you could just watch it live from anywhere, or over at the thread at DB address or IPN address, and then flush it to Filecoin.
It seems like a big deal. Looks like we could get rid of Zoom pretty soon.
Yeah. I have one that I've been like wanting. I think Carson said maybe it exists, so it would be one of those hacks that you're like, oh, but doesn't that exist? I'm not sure. So basically, there are two kind of problems that I hit with IPFS pretty regularly, and I was like, gosh, why don't we just fix those? One is that I mentioned this on the brainstorming session that Imgur, for example, is broken. They kind of like Web 2'd themselves out of being a useful API for me anymore. So my pattern with Imgur was always like, I had an image that I wanted to embed in say Markdown. So I'd put it over in Imgur, and then I'd get the URL and I'd put it back in Markdown. So then I'd have my image. That's become tricky. It's not impossible, but they've kind of made that direct URL kind of layers deep. And so it's not an easy workflow anymore because I'm not their target audience. But then I always was thinking, gosh, why don't I just do that on IPFS? That's a perfect thing to just do on IPFS. And now Buckets has made that pretty easy. So I can have a bucket on my desktop and I can drag new images into it. And then I get the ref to the image, and I can make my Markdown again. So that's problem one, and that's solved. And actually last weekend I did a hack of my own, and I built a browser extension on a bucket that will do the same thing. So I have like a little UI where I can drag and drop images, and it has all my images, and it has like a helpful copy link where I can just copy the markdown format or copy the HTML format to embed it in a document. I'll clean that up and I'll publish it probably before the end of the hackathon. But it's pretty ugly, so I don't want to put it up yet. But that works. But that's problem one. And then problem two, I started realizing is that once I do that, the only way to embed the image is actually to well, there's kind of two ways. One is to put the full image tag in my HTML or in my markdown, but pointing to a gateway, which is cool. It's like useful, but it's still on a gateway. And then the other way is if I actually use JS IPFS to take the CID and go pull the CID and everything. So my hack would actually be a little single-use library that was something like IPFS data attribute. And what I want is a custom data attribute on the image tag in HTML. So it'd be like it'd be image HTML and then data attribute CID. And if you put the CID in there, this like single-use library would load IPFS, go get that CID and replace the image with the data of the image. So it would be able to load any CID and display it as the image. And I think some of the work on putting basically IPFS into shared workers gets really cool there too, because I could then have an embed script or sort of embed copy for an image tag plus the script to load that JavaScript library where a user doesn't have to think about it. They just drop that into their HTML. And even if they load that script 30 times, it still would use the same instance of IPFS and queue all those CID requests and just drop all my images in. And then I have a real way for a developer just to have images pulled right from the IPFS network instead of pointing to gateways. So that would be my hack. I think it would take, a week of work or something like that, but would be very cool for my own use cases.
Awesome, that sounds great. Yeah, I would totally use that too. Screenshot on your Mac, and then all of a sudden you can IPFS link to that image. That'd be sick.
100%, yeah.
Awesome, cool. Sweet, well, I think, it goes without saying, really appreciate you two taking the time to chat with us. Thanks for your insights. And of course, thanks to Textile for being such a critical part of this event and for helping out with HackFS. So thanks so much for everybody, and awesome, we'll catch everybody on Slack.
Thanks for all your work.
Jacob. Thanks for having us.
Of course. Take care, everybody.